Herpes could never. Herpes could never break me, could never again make me feel less of. Herpes can't take my sexy away from me. Herpes does not take my worth away. Herpes does not devalue me. Herpes can
talk about how, and this is a common myth. I find myself telling people this all the time. For some reason, people who don't know anything about herpes think that people with herpes are just walking around bumpy all damn day, and that is not the truth, y'all.
No. Yeah, that's fucking hilarious. It's so true though. Like when we were taught, I mean, really, when you think about it in school, everybody made fun of herpes in sex ed class. We were immediately introduced to it in a negative way, and we were taught to hate it and to despise it, which is insane because you're right. This impression, when people hear the word herpes, they think you're just a walking open sore, which is ridiculous.
Giant bump. No. Actually, most people never even experience these sores. Most people never
Nope.
even experience the outbreaks. And
I get so many people that send me messages. They're like, I don't know what to do. I just tested positive and I've never had any signs or symptoms. And I was just like, well, welcome to the planet. You're part of the largest portion of the planet. What do I do?
Amber was like that. Amber was like, she, for the longest time, before she even got into herpes canaver, she was just waiting for this outbreak to happen,
And
thinking
it
that
never
she has
happened.
genital herpes. And
Yep.
I'm like, you're asymptomatic, Amber. You got to stop saying you have genital herpes because you don't even know if you have genital herpes. Just because you have HSV2 doesn't mean that you have genital herpes. And it
Nope.
was like, you know what? You're right, Shayna. Like, like, you got to stop saying that because you don't have it. You never
No.
experienced an outbreak down here.
You know what's crazy too is that I'll hear from I've heard at least a few times a month somebody saying I have genital herpes, but I don't know what type. And I was like, well, when you went to the doctor, did they swab it? No. So I went and got a blood test, and it came back type 1. But type 1 isn't on the genitals. And I'm like, okay, first of all, again, you can get it anywhere. Your doctor, for whatever reason, didn't swab the test and just assumed that it was type 2 because it was on your genitals. She's like, yeah, but I have type 1. And I'm like, yeah, you can get either type anywhere on your body. And she was completely blown away by that. She's like, well, why the fuck didn't my doctor test me and all this other? I'm like, listen, you got to kind of, I mean, doctors do get a bad rap, but
Mm-hmm.
they also know that herpes is everywhere, and they see several patients a day who every day they see patients who come in with herpes. It's like the common cold to them. So they should have a better bedside manner. They should
Yeah.
understand that when someone's first diagnosed, they're going to be a little scared and put off, and they should really
Mm-hmm.
start considering that. But a lot of times doctors will just assume that it's yeah, it's herpes. Here you go. Here's your prescription, which is pretty shitty. They got to get better at that. But the reason why that happened is because they just assumed it was type 2. But guess what? It's not. And
Yeah.
then she went into this whole thing. Well, I guess type 1 is better. And I'm like, I'm like, ooh, I want to kind of have this conversation with you, but I don't want to freak you out. And I'm like, they're
Yeah.
both basically the same. And she was like, what? I don't understand. Like she was losing her mind.
I
But
had first, before I even go into this, a lady in the park, someone was just like, "Those asymptomatic people are God's favorites." I can play devil advocates with that line all day long
mm,
because at the end of the day, for someone who experiences outbreaks, they know when they should probably, maybe I should refrain from sex because I'm having an outbreak, or I'm having some prodrome symptoms right now. I'm not gonna have sex because I'm trying my best not to spread my virus to my partner at this time. People who experience outbreaks have, better chance protecting their partners than someone who is asymptomatic. I talk to
right.
Amber all the time. She's asymptomatic, and she's just kind of like, I wish I had symptoms so that I can learn how the virus is affecting my body more, so that I had a way of telling maybe I'm not going through viral shedding, but I don't.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, she'll never know. And I don't know. I'm sure the person who said that is being facetious in
mhm.
some way. I the God conversation is a whole huge different type of conversation. And if you think that the God that you believe in is giving people herpes but keeping them asymptomatic, you should maybe ask, like, what about bone cancer in children and why there's amputees? I think I'll take asymptomatic herpes any day.
Let's not bring God into this though. She said
Yeah.
JK. But I was at the park and I had my herpes can never t-shirt on, and the lady comes up to me and she's like, "So what's up with that shirt?" And it to her like the movement and stuff, and she said, "Oh, I get them on my lips. Thank God I don't get them down there, but I get them on her lips." That was her,
Yeah.
attitude about it, and I'm just like, "Well, you can pass it to somebody
More
down there."
frequently. Yeah.
We
Well,
feel
that's part, isn't that funny how that works out that way? It's all part of that perception that somebody has through their experience.
mm-hmm.
And she just
And before I became this destigmatized person, when I was in the stigma, I used to think, well, I'm glad I have it down here because then no one can see it. I
right.
think of people who get cold sores, and I'm like, when you get a cold sore, everyone can see that you have herpes. That's the stigmatized version of me. So when I looked at her in her stigmatized version, just thinking, at least I don't get it down there, it's just
Yeah.
funny to see how we make ourselves feel better about our status, the different ways we try to go about making ourselves feel better.
Oh, sure. I mean, you're talking about confirmation bias, you're talking about denial. I mean, there's a lot of different human versions and interactions that applies to. I remember when I was first diagnosed, I was in denial, just total denial. Didn't want to know nothing, ignored it. Like, so believe me, I get it. Like,
Yeah.
there's so many different versions. And then, you know, for coming from a place that me and you come from, trying to help people and trying to educate, it sometimes, that perception fights that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because like there's so much information out there, and it's bad information. It's tough. It's tough for somebody who's just been diagnosed.
This is true. Um, I always mention how I tell the community that when you find out you have herpes, it's only you and your medical physician that's telling you that you have herpes, and yet you feel the weight of the stigma. Why? Because you're the bully in the mirror. And then our
Mm,
subconscious goes and does the work for us the minute we step out the door to find everything that proves us right. Therefore, you have just accepted the stigma and the narrative, and it becomes your new reality. And you never really give yourself a chance
yeah.
to live a different reality because you automatically accept the stigma the moment you find out you have herpes.
Yep.
Now, I
And it
thought
takes you down a negative path too. You start like being negative about everything, and you forget to be grateful for things, and it's really hard to break that.
you forget who you are. It's kind of like the
Yeah.
only thing that's changed in that moment is your knowing. That's the
Right.
only thing that has changed. And yet, all of a sudden, all these things are wrong with you. Well, were they already wrong with you? Were they already things you needed to work on when it came
Mm.
to your confidence and your insecurities? And now herpes is just bringing it to the surface and forcing you to deal with it?
Isn't that
Are
funny how
we
that
running?
works?
Yeah. Are we running to the stigma as a coping mechanism? Is it comfortable to blame your woes and how you feel about yourself on your stigma instead of dealing with it head on? So much mental play.
And it's all going on up here
Mm-hmm.
because nobody else is seeing any of it.
This is
You know,
it's
that's why
hard.
that's why I tell people all the time. They're like, "Well, I have anxiety and this and that, and I get it all the time, and I'm freaking out." And I'm like, "Okay, so forget herpes, forget everything else. Think of anxiety as noise." And they're like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, "Just think of it as noise. Think of something that caused you anxiety, like just say like last week, something that really kind of made you panic. You're like, oh my God, this is going to happen and this is going to happen and I don't know what to do. And then think about a few days later, what really transpired? What really took place? Was it any of those things that you thought was going to happen? She was like, no. I said, so it was just noise. And she was like, oh my God, I never thought of it that way. Ah! I'm like, it's really just kind of readjusting your perception. Just changing your perception just a little bit. Like, oh my God, if I go here and these people are going to say all these things to me. I was like, okay, well, wait a second. Why don't you just go there and see what happens? 9 times out of 10, the things that you got going on in your head, all that anxiety, they never fucking happen.
That part. You kind of create it for yourself.